Hi Guy, welcome back. TV spoilers. Jack Abbott was not accustomed to seeing the ghosts of Genoa City's darkest history materialize in his own home. Yet that evening, when he stepped over the threshold of the living room with the habitual composure of a man who had long lived inside corporate warfare, a cold sensation crept over him as if he had just laid his hand on ice. Matt Clark was sitting there. No shackles, no handcuffs, no uniformed officers standing watch. Only those flat, unreadable eyes Jack remembered from old files and from whispered fragments of stories about the havoc Matt had brought to Sharon, Nick, and the Newman family years ago. Matt's presence in the Abbott mansion was not merely a physical intrusion. It was an invasion of a particular kind of darkness Jack had always known existed on the fringes of Genoa City, but never truly expected to see sitting calmly on his own furniture. The man who should have been under heavy guard, hunted and cornered, somehow managed to sit with the unhurried posture of someone who had arrived right on time for a meeting he had scheduled himself. While Jack, the owner of the house, felt like the one who had come late, Jack's first instinct was purely reflexive, the reflex of a man who had spent years navigating both sides of the moral line, but still wanted to believe in the basic structure of right and wrong. He wanted to call the police to end this before it spiraled out of control, to hand Matt over to the system and let the courts deal with the monster everyone knew he was. In that impulse, there was a desire to protect his home, his family, and the fragile illusion that the Abbott mansion remained a sanctuary rather than a staging ground for something far more sinister. But as quickly as that impulse surfaced, it collided with another, older awareness: Victor Newman. Victor, with his controversial AI program, his pattern of questionable decisions, his tendency to move in the shadows under the banner of corporate necessity and family protection. Victor, who had turned manipulation into an art form and escaped consequence time and time again. Jack understood, in one sharp and disorienting instant, that Matt's arrival here as a fugitive from Newman control meant that a new and dangerous piece had just been dropped into his hands. From the moment he realized Matt was not tied down, not restrained, but had walked into this house under his own power, a different question began to pulse in Jack's head. What did Matt actually want? Coming here, of all places, to the home of one of Victor Newman's oldest enemies? The familiar walls of the Abbott home seemed to vibrate with tension. All the shared memories, family dinners, arguments, reconciliations, and quiet moments of comfort were abruptly overlaid with the knowledge that a predator sat in their midst. Jack harbored no illusions about Matt being any kind of victim. This was a man whose name had long been synonymous with trauma and violation, the source of nightmares that still lingered for people connected to Sharon and Nick. Yet the fact that Matt chose to seek out the Abbotts after slipping away from the Newmans could not be dismissed as coincidence. He understood the dynamics of the enemy of my enemy. He knew Victor was both his hunter and his former ally in schemes that pushed the limits of legality and ethics. Matt arrived not as a broken man seeking absolution, but as someone acutely aware of leverage. He knew Victor's AI program was under scrutiny. Knew public opinion could turn vicious at the slightest hint of abuse of power. New allegations of illegal surveillance or manipulation would shake Newman Enterprises to its core. He knew these were precisely the types of pressure points Jack Abbott had spent years dreaming of pressing. And so, Matt brought with him what he believed to be his strongest currency: information. Instead of immediately locking Matt away and treating him as a dangerous prisoner, Jack found himself stepping into a familiar but treacherous mental terrain. The place where strategy and morality collided. The man sitting across from him did not slump like someone begging for mercy. He presented himself like a negotiator, a survivor. Matt proposed cooperation in unemotional, transactional terms, protection from Victor and the authorities in exchange for testimony and secrets that could potentially cripple the Newman Empire's image and expose their use of AI as something far more insidious than a simple business tool. It was not remorse but survival instinct that guided Matt, and Jack could see that plainly. Even so, it was impossible to ignore the lure of what he represented. For years, Jack had watched Victor manipulate reality, reframe events, and twist narratives until he emerged less damaged than he deserved. Now, here was someone claiming to have the receipts for the very things Victor had tried to bury. Jack stood at a crossroads that felt far more personal than any corporate showdown. If he turned Matt over to the police immediately, he would be applauded by some, possibly even thanked by the Newmans in a fractured, grudging way. It would be the right thing to do. But that choice would also mean relinquishing a singular opportunity to force Victor into a corner he could not easily escape. On the other hand, if Jack accepted Matt's terms and allowed him to stay, if he orchestrated a narrative in which it looked as though the Abbotts had captured Matt and now held him as a bargaining chip, he could force Victor to confront the consequences of his clandestine moves with AI. The price of that second route, however, was steep. It required Jack to step into a gray zone where his actions could no longer be neatly justified as pure and righteous. It required him to treat his home like a secret holding cell, his moral code like something flexible enough to bend in the name of a longer game. In the quiet before his decision solidified, Jack could almost feel the years of accumulated anger toward Victor pressing down on him. So many times, he had watched the man walk away unscathed from maneuvers that would have destroyed anyone else. So many times he had swallowed his rage, buried his frustration, and tried to take the higher road, only to be rewarded with yet another reminder that Victor played by his own rules, and always seemed to have a way out. The idea of finally possessing something Victor did not control was intoxicating, even as it frightened him. He understood that using Matt meant aligning himself, however temporarily, with a monster. Yet he also understood that refusing this chance meant continuing to play the role of the better man in a game where that title seldom protected anyone. In the end, Jack made a choice that was as calculated as it was dangerous. He decided to seize the opportunity. The Abbott living room, with its familiar furniture and elegant touches, would become a carefully constructed stage. This was no longer simply a house, it was the set of a narrative Jack planned to script. He would redefine the circumstances. Matt would not be seen as a man who voluntarily walked in, but as someone the Abbotts now held under their control. If the story reached Victor's ears, and Jack fully intended that, it would be framed as a capture, not a visit. Jack cast himself as the director of this new drama, with Matt as his reluctant leading man and Victor as the sole audience whose reaction truly mattered. By claiming that his family was holding Matt, Jack created the illusion of total leverage. And in the battles he had fought with Victor over the years, illusions often proved sharper than facts. When Jack lifted the phone to call Victor, he did so with the full awareness that every single word could alter the shape of the conflict between their families. On the other end, Victor would not see the nuances of the scene, the absence of ropes, the calculating light in Matt's eyes, the tension in Jack's shoulders. He would only hear what Jack chose to reveal. Jack admitted that Matt was in his home, admitted that the Abbotts currently had him. In that admission, the truth was braided with a subtle lie. Matt was indeed physically present, but having him implied a level of dominance and containment that was not entirely accurate. Jack allowed that implication to stand because it served his purpose. Victor did not need to know that Matt had approached them with an offer, rather than being dragged in as a captive. What mattered was that Victor now knew Jack had something he desperately wanted to contain. In presenting his proposition, Jack did not bother softening the edges. This was not a friendly conversation about mutual interests. It was a quiet declaration of war framed as a negotiation. He made it clear that Matt was willing to testify, that he could corroborate allegations about the misuse of AI and other activities. Victor would never want dragged into the light of a courtroom. Merely invoking the AI program transformed this from a personal grudge into a looming scandal. It was not just a question of whether Victor might face legal consequences. It was about whether the myth of his invincibility could survive even the hint of illegal surveillance, manipulation, or clandestine data abuse. Jack's words carried an implication that went beyond any single trial. If Matt spoke, the aura surrounding Victor Newman, the aura of a titan beyond accountability, could fracture irrevocably. Even as Jack laid out his hand, a second, more worried voice whispered inside him. By hiding Matt, by choosing not to call the authorities immediately, he was not only endangering himself but potentially compromising everyone under his roof. Obstruction of justice, conspiracy, harboring a fugitive, the list of possible charges he might face if the scheme went wrong was not short. The Abbott name, already tested by scandals over the years, could be dragged into yet another headline. The distinction between being a man who sought justice and being a man who manipulated justice for personal revenge grew thinner by the second. Jack had always prided himself on not becoming the same kind of man Victor was, no matter how much he despised him. And deep down, the most unsettling question of all began to take shape. How far was he willing to blur that line for the chance to see Victor truly cornered? Across the room, Matt watched him with the cool detachment of someone used to chaos and conflict. Being recast as Jack's secret trump card did not seem to bother him. If anything, it confirmed his own belief that he still mattered in the city that had tried so hard to erase him. He understood that both Jack and Victor needed what he carried in his memories, details, conversations, instructions, the hidden mechanisms behind how the AI system had been weaponized under Victor's direction. Matt was a pariah, yes, but he was a pariah with knowledge that could inflict damage far beyond his own personal crimes. As long as that remained true, he was valuable. And as long as he was valuable, he could bargain. The Abbott mansion might be presented as his prison, but he saw the bars as thin. He knew Jack needed him alive, coherent and credible if he was ever to appear in front of a judge or a camera. He knew Victor needed him silent. To Matt, that tension between two powerful men meant one thing above all: time. Time to watch, to listen, to calculate the precise moment he could press his own advantage. Jack, for his part, could not bring himself to trust Matt completely, even within the narrow scope of this arrangement. Each time their eyes met, Jack was reminded of the histories Matt represented. The lives he had damaged, the fear he had sown, the trauma he had left scattered like broken glass in the past. Matt did not carry regret in his stare, he carried opportunism. His willingness to testify against Victor had nothing to do with remorse or a sudden embrace of justice. It was simply a pragmatic choice to avoid going down alone. That made him a useful asset and a potential catastrophe at the same time. Jack knew that if Matt saw a better offer from Victor or from anyone else, he would not hesitate to flip the board. The more Jack leaned on Matt as a weapon, the more he was forced to build mental armor against his own desperation, reminding himself again and again that this ally was, at best, conditional and temporary. During the call, Jack chose his phrasing with surgical precision. He did not reveal that Matt had willingly come to him, nor did he disclose the exact terms of their arrangement. Instead, he stressed that Matt was in Abbott hands and that he was ready to talk, ready to expose what had been done in the shadows under the guise of innovation and corporate dominance. Jack talked about the potential for cooperation, the possibility of containing this quietly before it erupted publicly. He dangled the prospect of discretion in front of Victor, while simultaneously emphasizing the risk of full disclosure. By leaving his intentions partly undefined, Jack constructed a labyrinth of possibilities around Victor. Negotiate and accept the tainted help of a rival, or refuse and risk watching a dangerous witness walk straight into a courtroom with stories that could burn everything down. When the connection finally went dead, the silence that followed seemed to thicken the air in the Abbott mansion. Outwardly, Jack had achieved what he set out to do. He had signaled to Victor that for once, the Abbotts possessed a piece of leverage he could not easily dismiss. He had used Matt's presence to inject uncertainty and fear into Victor's calculations. Yet Jack could not ignore the sensation that the walls around him were closing in by a fraction of an inch. His home, long a refuge for his family, was now doubling as a clandestine holding site for a notorious criminal, and as the headquarters of a scheme that, if mishandled, could blow back on everyone under its roof. The choice he had made in the name of forcing Victor to face consequences had simultaneously entangled the Abbotts in a narrative that could paint them as co-conspirators in a dangerous game with justice. Matt remained seated, quiet yet somehow dominant, as if he were savoring the sight of Jack wrestling with his own conscience. He had agreed to the provisional terms. He would testify. He would recount what he knew about Victor's exploits with AI and any other illicit activities he had witnessed, and he would at least in theory align himself with the Abbotts against Newman. In return, he expected protection, the kind of shield only a powerful family like the Abbotts might provide. No official documents had been signed, no formal promises exchanged. But both men understood a contract had been formed in all but name. It was a contract born not from mutual respect or shared ideals, but from mutual need and mutual distrust. Later, alone with his thoughts in a room that had hosted countless family gatherings, Jack felt the full weight of what he had set into motion. He imagined Victor at the Newman ranch, phone still warm in his hand, eyes narrowed, mind racing through every possible reason Jack would choose this moment to reach out. He imagined Victor questioning whether Matt was truly in Jack's custody, or whether this was some elaborate bluff. He imagined Victor's instinct to strike back rather than concede even an inch. Jack also imagined Matt's next move if he began to sense that either man might abandon him. Matt would not go quietly, that much was certain. And Jack, in acknowledging that reality, was forced to admit that he had invited something volatile into his home, not merely a person, but a living explosion of secrets and resentment. Somewhere between the ticking of the clock and the muffled sounds of the house settling into night, the lines Jack had drawn for himself over the years began to blur. All his vows that he would never become like Victor, never manipulate people as pieces on a board, never sacrifice principle for advantage, now felt less solid. Was he still the man who fought to protect his family by doing what was right? Or had he just launched a plan that could, in the wrong light, look indistinguishable from Victor's own tactics? In choosing to use Matt rather than surrender him, Jack had stepped off the safe path and onto a narrow ledge, where one misstep could send everyone plummeting. Yet even with doubt gnawing at him, Jack could not escape the grim satisfaction of knowing Victor would not sleep easily tonight. For once, the invincible patriarch of Newman Enterprises had to wonder just how much of his carefully constructed world could be ripped open by the testimony of a man he once thought he could control. And that knowledge, dangerous and bitter as it was, kept Jack rooted to his decision. The game had already started. Pulling back now would not erase what had been said or undo the reality of Matt Clark sitting under his roof. The agreement was fragile, the balance precarious, and everyone involved was one bad decision away from catastrophe. Victor could agree to a compromise, attempt to neutralize the threat quietly, or he could retaliate and try to reclaim control over the situation in his usual ruthless fashion. Matt could uphold his end of the bargain and walk into a courtroom under Abbott protection, or he could switch allegiances the moment a more promising lifeline appeared. Jack could continue down this path, tightening his grip on Matt and the leverage he represented. Or he could find himself forced to choose between his desire to see Victor fall and his need to protect his own soul from becoming irreparably stained. For now, nothing had exploded. No sirens wailed at the gates, no headlines blared across the news. The city remained unaware that one of its oldest grudges had just evolved into something far more dangerous and far more intimate. But deep inside the Abbott mansion, beneath the veneer of calm, a new story was already unfolding, one in which justice and revenge looked disturbingly alike, and in which every move Jack Abbott made from this point on could determine whether he finally brought Victor Newman to his knees, or whether he had just invited a far more insidious disaster into his own home, waiting quietly for the perfect moment to detonate. The meeting between Jack Abbott and Victor Newman was not an unexpected item on the calendar, but the atmosphere that settled over the room from the moment Jack walked in felt very different from every confrontation they had ever had before. This was not one of those loud boardroom arguments or indirect attacks through the press. This time, the air was heavy with silence and the unspoken admission that both men were holding cards that could change the entire balance of Genoa City. Jack walked in with his shoulders straight and that familiar composure of a businessman who had long since learned to look Victor in the eye without flinching. But behind that calm gaze there was a tension he could not entirely hide. He knew that with a single wrong move, not only Abbott but the entire Abbott legacy could be pulled into a war dirtier than any they had fought before. Victor sat waiting like a king accustomed to subjects coming to him. But deep in his eyes there was a flicker of wariness. Because whenever Jack appeared without a clear, pre-announced reason, it almost never meant anything good. Jack did not circle around the point. He wasn't there to exchange barbs or rehash the old battles that had defined them for decades. He came with one purpose and knew he didn't have the luxury of wasting time. In the very first seconds, Jack dropped the name that had become a ghost haunting both the Newman and Abbott families recently. Matt Clark. He revealed that Matt was now under his control, that the Abbotts had caught him, and that Matt was no longer roaming free outside, sowing chaos. That information ripped through the room like a tear in the air itself. Victor, even as a man used to bad news, couldn't entirely mask his reaction. In his mind, theories flew by in a rush. Was Jack exaggerating? Was he fabricating a story to lure Victor into a trap? Or worse, had Jack truly managed to get his hands on the one man Victor would rather see buried forever than walking into a courtroom with memories that had never been committed to paper? Victor's suspicion showed plainly in his eyes, but Jack had prepared for that. Victor assumed Jack wanted to use Matt for his own ends, maybe to blackmail him, maybe to drag Newman into a disadvantageous negotiation, maybe just to experience the satisfaction of finally being on top after so many years of being outplayed. In Victor's worldview, everyone acted from self-interest, and Jack was no exception. What unsettled Victor this time was the sense that Jack's motives went beyond a simple business victory. There was something deeper and darker driving Jack to take a risk this big. Matt Clark was not someone most people dared to touch, and the fact that Jack was willing to bring him into the equation meant Jack was prepared to live with consequences that could spiral beyond his control. But Jack refused to let Victor steer the conversation in that direction. He lowered his voice slightly, cutting off any assumption that this deal revolved around Matt himself. He made it clear that this was not a transaction trading one criminal's fate for a few boardroom advantages. Matt was a catalyst, a consequence, but not the heart of this negotiation. What Jack truly wanted to address was the root of everything: the actions Victor had been taking behind the shiny facade of technological progress and family protection. Jack stated bluntly that the deal had nothing to do with bargaining over Matt Clark. The focal point was Victor's own behavior, specifically how he had used artificial intelligence as a weapon to destroy Matt's finances, tear his life apart, and leave him with nothing. At that moment, Another name Victor didn't want to hear in this context was dragged into the light: Kyle. Jack brought his son into the story not to heighten the drama but because Kyle was the one who had patiently followed the trail, dissected the system, and discovered the anomalies hidden in the transactions. He was the one who ultimately concluded that the financial blows against Matt Clark were not random. Jack described the long nights Kyle spent in front of screens, cross-checking data, recognizing the familiar pattern of an AI system that wasn't just analyzing markets, but being steered to attack a specific target. Behind those cold numbers lay the imprint of Newman control, of the very machine Victor had proudly introduced to the world as the future of business. Kyle had seen that and he had brought those findings to Jack, not just as a professional report but as a warning that Victor had gone so far as to use advanced tech to wipe a man off the financial map, reducing him to a plaything in a simulation. In Jack's mind, the puzzle pieces snapped together. Matt Clark hadn't just returned to Genoa City as a ghost of the past. He'd come back as a man who had been pushed right to the edge. His accounts frozen, assets melted away. Every path to redemption, however faint, choked off by the pressure of an AI system, programmed to crush him. Victor could rationalize it as neutralizing a threat. But Jack saw clearly that this wasn't just another morally gray maneuver Victor could shrug off. This was a deliberate warping of the rules, turning a human being, even a monster of a man, into prey for a cold, calculating machine. Jack insisted that this very act had driven Matt down the path of revenge, shaping him into a threat not only to the Newman and Abbott households, but to the entire city. What truly enraged Jack wasn't simply that Matt had risen up seeking vengeance, although that alone was dangerous enough. It was the fact that Victor behaved as if this outcome were somehow beyond his responsibility. To Victor, Matt was a hazard that needed to be removed. If the AI system could accomplish that cleanly on paper, then it was just a strategic decision. But to Jack, the truth was far simpler. Victor had created a cornered animal and now pretended to be surprised when it turned around and started biting everyone in its path. Genoa City was paying the price for a power game Victor always believed he could control. The attacks, the revenge plots, the innocent people dragged into the fallout, all of it was tied in one way or another to the cold clicks and commands Victor had authorized. On a deeper level, Jack also thought of himself. He had not forgotten that he chose to keep Matt, to turn him into a strategic piece. He didn't paint himself as a hero, but he recognized a crucial difference. At least he wasn't hiding behind lofty slogans about progress or safety. Victor hid inside grand narratives, justifying everything with family and protection, even as he crafted and unleashed a tool with destructive potential far beyond anyone's imagination. That was why Jack decided to draw a line, not just for Victor but for himself. He hadn't come to this meeting for simple revenge. He came to stop something that, if left unchecked, would keep creating more Matt Clarks in the future. Once the truths were laid out on the table, Jack finally delivered his demand. He didn't ask for shares. He didn't ask for a seat at Newman's board or for the kind of leverage Victor could haggle over. The one thing Jack wanted was also the one thing most likely to feel like a slap in Victor's face. He demanded that Victor shut down his artificial intelligence program immediately, abandoning it entirely in all business and monitoring operations. At the same time, Jack insisted that Victor cease all attacks on Abbott, every covert strike, every creeping market move, every competitive tactic that Jack knew was really a war of attrition, designed to break his company. This wasn't a polite request. It was an ultimatum. Jack didn't have to raise his voice, but every word carried the hard edge of someone who had carefully measured the cost he was willing to bear. He made it crystal clear that if Victor refused, if the AI program continued, if the assaults on Abbott didn't stop, he would make everything Kyle had discovered public. He would show the world how Victor had used his technology to choke the life out of a man, and then act innocent when that man exploded back into their lives as a walking threat. Jack wasn't just threatening to expose Victor on a personal level. He was threatening to put him on trial before the public, the law, shareholders, and family, all the people who believed the family man myth Victor had built. Jack was ready to say what no one wanted to hear, that Victor, by playing with technological fire, had helped forge the most dangerous version of Matt Clark Genoa City had ever seen. Victor's reaction, as Jack expected, was an eruption of anger. But it wasn't the kind of anger easily read from shouting or theatrics. It showed in the way his eyes turned harder, in the way his hand tightened on the arm of the chair, in the heavy silence he allowed to stretch until the room felt suffocating. Victor wasn't accustomed to being cornered like this. He had been blackmailed before, betrayed, challenged, but rarely forced to face something he knew he could not completely deny: data. The AI he had proudly paraded as a symbol of innovation was now a living piece of evidence, proof of how far he had been willing to go. If Jack truly had the proof that Kyle had uncovered, if that ever reached investigators or the press, Victor understood the consequences wouldn't just be a few sensational headlines. His image, his power, the long-term future of Newman Enterprises could all be shaken at their roots. That fury mingled with another, more unsettling realization, one that Victor hated to acknowledge but could not refute. Jack was holding an extraordinarily powerful trump card, not only because he had Matt Clark in his orbit, but because he had seen through the veneer of moral justification surrounding the AI program. Jack understood what the system was, what it had done, and how it would be interpreted by people outside Victor's sphere of influence. For the first time in years, Victor felt he did not fully control the board. He could cling to his pride, refuse all demands, and trust that he was still strong enough to crush any attack. But he also had to ask himself whether this was a fight he could win with the same old tactics, or whether the very technology he had relied on would now stand as a silent witness against him. Jack saw those tiny shifts in Victor's expression, and in that fleeting moment he knew he had struck the nerve he'd been aiming for. Yet even as he savored that rare sense of leverage, he couldn't feel entirely secure. He knew Victor was not the sort of man to accept defeat, simply because he'd been backed into a corner. Victor was the sort who would search for another escape route, another angle of attack, another way to flip the entire situation upside down if he could. The ultimatum Jack had delivered had changed the balance of power, but it had also unleashed another kind of danger, a Victor Newman who had been wounded, challenged, and forced to choose between surrendering and striking back harder than ever. The meeting ended without a signed agreement, without a hollow handshake, but with a silence heavy as stone. Jack left believing that this time he had forced Victor to think seriously about where the line lay between power and destruction. He hoped he had done enough to stop a future in which AI continued to be used like a surgical blade, cutting down anyone Victor deemed a threat. Yet as the door closed behind him, the room still held the echo of Victor's gaze, a look that contained not only anger, but something quieter and far more frightening, calculation. Alone, Victor leaned back in his chair, but his mind did not rest. He thought of Matt Clark, of the fact that this monster was now in Jack's hands, of the possibility that Matt would say anything and everything to save himself. He thought of Kyle, of how deep the young man had dug into the system, of the code, the traces Victor had believed he had erased. He thought of Jack, of the fact that his oldest rival now dared to demand not just a tactical concession, but the abandonment of a cornerstone of his vision for the future. The pieces of the picture came into sharper focus. If he yielded, he would have to accept that Jack had won this round, that he himself had made a catastrophic move. If he did not yield, he would have to prepare for a war with no retreat, where the first person to stumble would not just lose ground but possibly lose everything. A cold gleam flickered in Victor's eyes as he looked down at the table, where the AI document still lay like a physical reminder of his ambition. He knew Jack believed he had trapped him into choosing between surrender and exposure. But Victor Newman had never been a man limited to just two options. Somewhere deep inside him, an idea began to form, slow, dangerous, and entirely incompatible with any of the rules Jack hoped he would follow. Because if Jack Abbott dared to use Matt Clark as a trump card to force Victor to back down, then what would happen if Victor decided that this particular card shouldn't exist on the board for one more second at all? On our TV Spoilers channel, I'm always looking for content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting insights. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.